There is a kind of person who walks into a room and says almost nothing. They don't announce themselves. They don't fill the silence with noise. They simply observe, feel, and understand, often more than anyone else in that room ever will. And for most of their life, the world has told them that this is a problem. You've probably been told you're too quiet, too sensitive, too deep, that you think too much, feel too much, hold too much inside, that something about the way you move through the world is slightly off, slightly too slow, too careful, too aware. And because the world rewards loudness, you began to wonder if the way you were built was actually a flaw. But here is what no one told you. Silence is not absence. It is not emptiness. It is not fear wearing a quiet mask. In the people who carry it with intention, people like you, silence is the result of having processed more than most people even notice. It is the product of a mind that has already asked the question, felt the answer, and decided that not everything deserves a response. The most powerful people are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones who have learned, sometimes through years of pain, that observation is sharper than reaction, that patience outlasts impulse, that the person who speaks last speaks with the most weight. What you were never taught is that your silence was never a weakness hiding in plain sight. It was a rare kind of intelligence that most people aren't built to recognize. So before you continue watching this, ask yourself something honest. When was the last time your silence was actually understood? Not tolerated, not questioned, but genuinely seen for what it was? Because what you're about to discover is that the traits you've been quietly carrying, the ones that made you feel different, out of place, or simply too much, are not what you think they are. They are something far more uncommon than that. You walk into a room, and within seconds, you already know. You know who is hurting beneath their smile. You know when the tension between two people hasn't been spoken yet, but is already filling the air. You know when someone's words and their energy are telling two completely different stories. And the strangest part, the part that exhausts you more than anything else, is that you never asked for any of it. This is not something you learned. It is something you were born carrying. Most people move through the world taking things at face value. They hear the words, and they believe the words. They see the smile, and they accept the smile. But you have never had that luxury. From the time you were young, you felt beneath the surface of things, the undercurrent of what people were actually feeling, actually needing, actually afraid to say. And while that depth gave you a rare kind of understanding, it also gave you something no one ever warned you about. It gave you a weight that never fully lifts. Because absorbing that much, feeling that much, is not peaceful. It is not some gentle, beautiful gift that arrives wrapped in clarity. It is loud. It is relentless. It is walking into a conversation and leaving it carrying emotions that were never yours to begin with. It is lying awake at night replaying a moment that hurt someone else, feeling it in your own chest as though it happened to you. It is being in a crowded room and somehow feeling more alone than you would in complete silence, because you are surrounded by energy you can feel but cannot explain, and no one around you seems to notice any of it. So you went inward. Not because you stopped caring, but because caring that much with nowhere to put it becomes its own kind of survival instinct. You learned to stay quiet not from fear, but from overflow. There is simply too much happening inside you to translate it all into words that others would understand. And so you held it. You processed it alone. You became the person who observed more than they spoke, who felt more than they showed, who carried more than anyone around them ever realized. The loneliness in that is something that is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. It is not the loneliness of being unloved. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only see the surface of you, who know your name, your laugh, your presence, but have never once touched the depth of what you actually carry inside. And here is the part that cuts the deepest. You became so used to holding space for everyone else's emotions that you forgot, or maybe never learned, how to ask someone to hold space for yours. You became the listener, the stabilizer, the one people came to when they needed to feel understood. And in all of that giving, in all of that quiet absorbing, you slowly learned to make yourself smaller. Not because you were weak, but because the world kept showing you that your depth made other people uncomfortable. That is not a personal failure. That is the inevitable result of being wired for depth in a world that keeps rewarding noise. What you were experiencing was never too much. It was simply more than most people are built to understand. There comes a point in the life of someone like you where you stop trying to explain what is happening inside you. Not because the words aren't there. The words have always been there. But because you have learned slowly, painfully, through repeated experience, that not every person is capable of receiving what you carry. You opened up once, maybe more than once. You chose someone you trusted, handed them something real, something vulnerable, something that cost you to say out loud. And what came back was not understanding. What came back was minimizing, a blank stare, a subject change, a response so disconnected from what you had just shared that you felt more alone after speaking than you did before. So you filed that moment away, and you moved on. Then, it happened again, with someone else, in a different setting, a different relationship, but the same result, the same quiet sting of realizing that what felt enormous to you barely registered to them. And over time, without even making a conscious decision, you began to close the door, not from bitterness, not from distrust of all people everywhere, but from something far more rational than that. You learned discernment. This is what most people misread about silent empaths. They assume the silence is sadness. They assume it is anxiety or arrogance or an inability to connect. But what they are actually seeing is the result of a very intelligent internal system, one that has been quietly cataloging every experience where openness led to pain and drawing a careful, necessary boundary around what gets shared and with whom. Psychologists call patterns like this learned behavior. But for you, it never felt like learning. It felt like survival. Because when you are someone who feels as deeply as you do, being misunderstood is not a minor inconvenience. It doesn't roll off easily. It settles. It compounds. Every dismissal added a layer. Every moment of being told you were overreacting, too emotional, too intense. It didn't harden you so much as it taught you to be careful, to watch first, to wait, to decide whether the person in front of you had actually earned the right to the real version of you. And most people, you discovered, had not. This is not cynicism. This is calibration. There is a profound difference between someone who has closed off from the world and someone who has simply become intentional about where they place their energy. One is a wound. The other is wisdom. And what you developed, even without realizing it, was a kind of emotional intelligence that most people spend decades trying to build and never quite reach. You stopped explaining yourself because explanation without comprehension is just noise. You stopped justifying your feelings because the people demanding justification were never actually interested in understanding. You stopped shrinking yourself into language that others could digest comfortably because you realized that no version of you that fits neatly into someone else's comfort zone is ever the true version. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the space left behind when you finally stopped pouring yourself into containers that were never built to hold you. And somewhere beneath that silence, something else was quietly beginning to form. Not a wall, not a wound, something far more steady than either of those things. The beginning of a standard. One that would, in time, change everything about how you moved through the world. There is a moment that arrives differently for everyone, but feels almost identical on the inside. It is not dramatic. It does not come with a revelation that lights up the sky or a conversation that changes everything in an instant. It comes quietly, usually alone, usually in an ordinary moment, sitting in silence after a draining interaction, or lying awake at 3 in the morning with no particular thought triggering it, when something inside you simply shifts. And in that moment, you stop asking what is wrong with you. For years, that question had been the background noise of your inner life. Why do I feel things so much more deeply than everyone around me seems to? Why does conflict leave me drained for days when others seem to shake it off in minutes? Why do I sense things in people that they haven't said yet, feel things in rooms that no one else seems to notice, carry weight from interactions that others have already forgotten? Why, despite everything I give, does connection still feel so difficult to hold on to? You turn those questions inward like an accusation. You treated your sensitivity as a malfunction. You looked at the gap between how you experienced the world and how everyone else seemed to experience it, and you concluded, because no one told you otherwise, that the gap was your fault. But the awakening comes when you finally consider a different possibility. What if you were never malfunctioning? What if you were never too much, too deep, too sensitive, too slow to recover? What if the problem was never the way you were built, but simply that the world around you was not built with people like you in mind? This is not a comfortable thought, because accepting it means releasing something you have quietly held on to for a long time. The belief that if you just adjusted enough, explained yourself better, felt things a little less intensely, you would finally fit. That the solution was always somewhere inside your own behavior, your own expression, your own need to take up less space. The awakening asks you to let go of that. It asks you to look back at your history, not as a record of failures and misalignments, but as evidence of something else entirely. Every time you were called too sensitive, you were actually demonstrating a level of emotional perception that most people are not capable of. Every time you were dismissed for feeling too deeply, you were processing layers of experience that others were simply not equipped to reach. Every relationship that drained you, every environment that felt wrong, every room where you sat quietly on the outside of conversations that felt hollow, none of that was proof of your inadequacy. It was proof of your depth operating in shallow spaces. You were not broken. You were broadcasting on a frequency that most people around you did not have the range to receive. And when no one receives your signal for long enough, it is natural, completely human, to assume the signal itself is the problem. But signals do not become invalid because the wrong receivers are in the room. This realization does not arrive all at once. It settles slowly, like light filling a space after a long darkness. And as it settles, something remarkable begins to happen. The pain of your past starts to reorganize itself. The memories that once felt like evidence of your brokenness begin to look like something different, something closer to the portrait of a person who is always operating with more awareness, more feeling, more depth than the situations around them could accommodate. That is not a flaw. That has never been a flaw. And once you see it clearly, once you truly understand that the world not being built for you was never a verdict on your worth, you stop trying to redesign yourself to fit inside it. You stop apologizing for the frequency you carry. And for the first time, perhaps in a very long time, you begin to wonder what becomes possible when you stop shrinking and simply let yourself exist at full depth. That question is where everything begins to change. There is no single day that marks the change. No precise moment you can point to on a calendar and say, that is when everything shifted. But looking back, you will know it happened. Because the person you were before it and the person you became after it are not quite the same. Something internal reorganized itself. Something that had been slowly building beneath the surface finally broke through. And when it did, the first thing it changed was not how you treated others. It changed how you allowed others to treat you. For a long time, you operated from a quiet, unspoken belief that your needs were negotiable, that your feelings, while real, were perhaps too inconvenient to place at the center of any equation. You became fluent in the language of accommodation, reshaping yourself around other people's comfort, absorbing blame that was never yours to carry, explaining yourself in careful, measured terms designed not to upset, not to overwhelm, not to ask for too much. You gave endlessly. You adjusted constantly. And somewhere inside all of that giving, you lost the thread of who you actually were beneath the performance of keeping everyone else at ease. This is what people-pleasing really is beneath the surface. It is not kindness. It is fear wearing the mask of generosity. It is the deeply conditioned belief that your acceptance in any relationship depends on how little space you take up, how rarely you disappoint, how consistently you place everyone else's emotional reality above your own. And for someone as sensitive as you, that conditioning runs deep because you could always feel when others were uncomfortable. And somewhere along the way, you made it your responsibility to fix it. But the day you chose yourself was the day you quietly stopped. Not with anger, not with a dramatic declaration or a door slammed shut behind you. The shift was far subtler than that, and far more permanent. It was the moment you looked at a situation, a relationship, a dynamic, a pattern that had been draining you for longer than you wanted to admit. And instead of asking how you could adjust yourself to survive inside it, you asked a different question entirely. You asked whether it deserved your presence at all. That question changed everything. Because the moment you began measuring relationships by what they cost you rather than simply what they required of you, the old patterns began to lose their hold. The urge to over-explain yourself softened, because you realized that the people who genuinely understood you had never needed the explanation in the first place. The compulsion to chase validation from those who withheld it began to loosen, because you finally understood that no amount of effort extracts genuine recognition from someone who was never willing to give it. You stopped performing depth for people who only wanted the surface. What emerged in the space left behind was not coldness. It was not indifference. It was something that looked, from the outside, like quiet confidence, but felt from the inside, like the first full breath you had taken in years. It was the natural result of a standard forming. Not a wall built from pain, but a boundary built from self-knowledge. The recognition that your energy, your emotional depth, your time, your care, none of these things are unlimited resources to be distributed without discernment. They are rare. They deserve to be treated as such. The old version of you absorbed chaos because you believed harmony was your responsibility to create, even at the cost of your own peace. The version of you that emerged from this shift understood something different. That real harmony, the kind that is sustainable, is never built on one person's willingness to disappear into it. You stop shrinking, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, in the direction of yourself. And that quiet movement, that slow return to your own center, was the most powerful thing you had ever done. There is something that happens when a person has spent years feeling everything deeply, being misread consistently, and learning through experience exactly where openness leads and where it doesn't. They develop something that cannot be taught in a classroom, cannot be acquired through ambition, and cannot be faked in the presence of someone who actually has it. They develop a rare, quiet form of intelligence that operates beneath the surface of every interaction, watching, measuring, understanding, while the rest of the world mistakes their stillness for emptiness. This is the part of you that most people never see, and it is the most powerful part. The first trait is emotional discernment, not empathy in the broad, general sense. You already know you carry that, but something more refined than that. Something sharper, the ability to distinguish between what a person is presenting and what they are actually experiencing. To sense the gap between someone's words and their energy. To feel, without being told, when a situation is not what it appears to be. Most people take the world at face value because it is easier and requires less of them. You have never had that option. And what grew in its place was a perceptual ability, so precise that it borders on the instinctual. You know things before you can explain how you know them. The second trait is your capacity to detect deception, not through suspicion, not through paranoia, but through pattern recognition that has been quietly developing your entire life. You have felt enough incongruence to recognize it immediately. You have been around enough people whose outer presentation did not match their inner reality that your nervous system has essentially learned to read the difference automatically. This is not a gift that arrives gently. It is built from experience. From the times you ignored what you sensed and paid the price for it. From the moments you trusted the signal your body was sending before your mind had caught up and were proven right in ways you wish you hadn't been. That hard-earned perception is not a burden. It is a form of armor most people spend their entire lives without. The third trait is perhaps the most misunderstood of all. The discipline of observation over reaction. In a world that rewards immediacy, that celebrates the fastest response and the loudest opinion, the person who pauses, watches, and chooses their moment carefully is almost always underestimated. And that underestimation is, quietly, one of your greatest advantages. Because while others are reacting, you are reading. While others are performing, you are understanding. The information you gather in silence about people's motivations, their patterns, their fears, their genuine character, is information they are handing you freely, simply because they assume your silence means you are not paying attention. You are always paying attention. The fourth trait is the one that perhaps defines you most completely at this stage of your evolution: the ability to remain unmoved in chaos. This did not come easily. It was forged in every moment you survived an emotional storm that had no logical origin, in every environment that was designed to destabilize you, in every relationship that tried to pull your sense of self off its axis. What came out the other side of all of that is not numbness. It is steadiness, the deep, unshakable quality of a person who has already faced the most disorienting versions of their inner world and found that they did not collapse. Chaos does not frighten you the way it once did, and people who rely on chaos to control others sense that immediately. This is the truth about your silence that no one ever framed correctly. It was never surrender. It was never absence. It was strategy, awareness, and depth operating in a frequency too quiet for most people to detect. But it was never quiet because it was small. It was quiet because it was certain. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives not with noise, but with stillness. It does not announce itself. It does not come wrapped in celebration or marked by any visible moment of triumph. It arrives the day you stop treating your own nature as something that requires an apology. The day you stop prefacing your depth with disclaimers, stop softening your perception to make others comfortable, stop folding yourself into shapes that were never designed to hold you. That day, something fundamental changes, not in the world around you, but in the way you inhabit it. You become, for the first time, fully yourself. And that is more powerful than most people understand. Because there is something that happens to a person who stops fighting what they are. The energy that was spent in constant self-correction, in the endless effort of managing how your sensitivity was perceived, minimizing how much you felt, performing a lighter version of yourself for rooms that couldn't handle the real one, that energy returns to you. And what you do with it is not loud or dramatic. You simply become more present, more grounded, more difficult to move from your center, harder to manipulate. That is perhaps the most unexpected part of this transformation. The empath who was once so open, so feeling, so attuned to what others needed that they could be steered by a shift in someone's tone, that person no longer exists in the same form. Because manipulation requires a gap. It requires uncertainty about your own worth, confusion about your own perceptions, a habit of prioritizing someone else's emotional comfort above the evidence your own instincts are presenting to you. When those gaps close, when you have done the slow, private work of trusting yourself, manipulation loses its entry points. It finds no purchase. It slides off. You become slower to react, not because you feel less, but because you have finally separated the ability to feel deeply from the compulsion to respond immediately. You understand now that your first awareness of something and your response to it do not need to occupy the same moment. That the pause between feeling and speaking is not weakness, it is precision. It is the difference between being moved by everything and being controlled by nothing. And you become, in the truest sense of the phrase, impossible to destabilize. Not because life stops presenting difficulty. Not because people stop trying to project their chaos onto you or test the steadiness they sense in your silence. But because you have been to the depths of your own interior, and you know what lives there. You know your own foundation. And a person who knows their own foundation cannot be shaken by someone who is simply making noise above the surface. This is what the full evolution of a silent empath produces. Not someone who has become cold or detached or unreachable, but someone who has become whole. Someone who carries their sensitivity not as a wound they are managing, but as a tool they have learned to wield with extraordinary care and precision. Someone who gives, still gives, deeply, but from a place of overflow rather than depletion, from choice rather than compulsion. What this transformation costs is real. It costs you certain relationships that were built on your smallness. It costs you the comfort of familiar patterns, even painful ones. It costs you the version of yourself that kept everyone else at ease by keeping yourself invisible. What it builds is something that cannot be taken from you. A self that is entirely, unapologetically, unmistakably your own. If you have stayed with this until now, it is probably because something in these words recognized you. Not the surface version of you that moves through the world managing impressions and navigating expectations, but the deeper version. The one that has always felt more than it showed, understood more than it said, and carried more than anyone around it ever knew. That version of you was never too much. It was never broken, never misdirected, never in need of correction. It was simply operating at a depth that most of the people and places in your life were not prepared to meet. And when depth goes unmet for long enough, it begins to believe the problem is the depth itself. It begins to fold inward, apologize for its presence, and call its own nature a flaw. But you know better now. The silence was never emptiness. It was everything you had already processed, everything you had already felt and examined and decided wasn't worth handing to someone who wouldn't understand it. It was discernment. It was dignity. It was the quiet, steady refusal to reduce yourself to a size that made others more comfortable at the expense of what made you real. You were not too much. You were simply too layered for people who had only ever learned to read the surface. If something in this video reached a part of you that rarely gets reached, if it named something you have carried for a long time without the right words for it, leave a comment below. Not for the algorithm, but because there is something powerful about seeing your own experience reflected back in someone else's words and saying, yes, that is exactly it. That moment of recognition matters. And if you believe someone else needs to hear this today, share it with them quietly, the way you do everything else that actually means something to you. Because the world needs more people who feel deeply and have finally stopped apologizing for it. You were never too much. You were just surrounded by too little.